Greetings, all you apocalypsers. Welcome back to our study of the book of Revelation. Today we're going to look at chapters 6 and 7, and the slide in view with the brightness in the upper left-hand corner overtaking the earth is my perhaps fanciful idea of what at least one element of the return of Jesus Christ is going to look like, with the brightness of his glory coming on the clouds with great glory and power. So I kind of put that in the category of just imagine. However, we are beginning to look at chapters 6 through 19, which outline the unfolding of the seven seal judgments, the seven trumpet judgments, and finally the seven bowl judgments. So perhaps this next slide is a little more in keeping with the theme of chapters 6 through 19. We're going to see that thunder, lightning, earthquakes, noises, voices, hail, those kind of things accompany the seventh in each of those three series of judgment. So I've chosen to use this photograph. It's a volcanic eruption, basically, as a backdrop to those chapters. Because as we saw in the introduction, Psalm 18 is a picture of, it's a theophany, a God coming from heaven to earth on clouds and thick darkness with thunder, lightning, and all kinds of judgment motifs attached to that particular song. And so we'll just use this as our background. We'll start out way back in Exodus at Mount Sinai, where the earth was shaking. This Mount Sinai, which didn't have a stick of wood on it anywhere, it was all rocks. It was burning. It was on fire. It was smoking. There was a sound of a trumpet. The earth was shaking. The people were terrified, as you can tell from this slide. Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning, the sound of the trumpet, the mountains smoking, and when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, "You go speak with God, and then you come and tell us what he said. But let us not speak directly with God, lest we die." And thankfully, we are in a different covenant now, where our mediator is with us. He's indwelling us in the Holy Spirit, and that veil that was between us and God has been torn in two, and now we have the right to come boldly before the throne of grace to obtain grace in the time of need. And so this picture from the Old Testament is one of terrifying judgment, and rightfully so. And we'll see these as these series of seven judgments, the three of them unfold. We'll see some pretty intense moments as we go through it. So here we go into chapters 6 and 7. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you. We thank you that you are the Alpha and the Omega. You are the beginning and you are the end. And Lord, we're starting to look at the end here, the end of time, the end of sin on the earth. We're going to see the results of allowing sin to run its course. And Lord, I pray that we would react to this, respond to this in a way that honors you. So speak to us, give us eyes to see, ears to hear. Let your word speak to us. Lord, may you speak to us through your word. And thank you, Lord, for the life that you've given us and the life that's yet to come. We bless and praise your holy name. Amen. So let's just look at the seventh in each series. Actually, we're going to start with what we saw in chapter 4, verse 5. And from the throne, what did we see? Lightnings, thunderings, and voices. And let's look at the seventh seal. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake. Okay, let's look at the seventh trumpet. And there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, and earthquake, and great hail. And finally, the seventh bowl. Noises, thunderings, lightnings, a great earthquake, and great hail from heaven, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. A talent is somewhere between 75 and 100 pounds. So imagine you're standing outside in a hailstorm with each hailstone weighing about half as much as you do. 75 pounds. Now, don't take offense at that. My math may not be good. So those of you who are thinner in stature and lighter in weight, please don't. I'm not trying to make any comments in that direction. But I weigh about 180 pounds, and so half my weight is 90. And so I can't imagine standing outside and having a 90-pound hailstone hit me. Terminal velocity of that thing would be about, I don't know, 120, 150 miles an hour. Game over. I mean, I'm just going to be a spot on the ground if that thing hits me. And so these are all just to say that this picture, our background picture, has quite a bit of relevance in terms of what we're about to look at. So here we have the judgment motif, and we're going to look in chapter. So here's a scroll with 7 seals, and chapter 6 looks at the loosing or the breaking, the removal of the first 6 of these 7 seals. So let's take a look. The unsealing of the scroll with 7 seals. Now remember, this follows the sequence in heaven where John sees and describes the throne in chapter 4 and the beings around the throne in chapter 4. Then the first thing he sees in our what we call chapter 5, remember there's no chapter divisions in the original. He sees the scroll in the right hand of him who sat on the throne. Then in the midst of the throne and in the midst of the 4 living creatures and in the midst of the elders stood a lamb, as though it had been slain. And here is the central verse, in my opinion at any rate, for this particular passage. Then he, Jesus, the Lamb, came and took the scroll out of the right hand of him who sat on the throne. As we move into chapter 6, the first 2 verses say, "Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, 'Come and see.'" I need to stop right there and make a comment. A lot of the translations, if you look at them, leave out that see part. So their translation is simply come. Come and see is sometimes taken as, there are a couple manuscripts that have that, but the main central manuscripts, the one that a lot of the translation committees use, do not have the and see part. So it's simply come, and that word could also mean go forth or ride forth. So the thinking there is this is not an invitation for John to come and see what this is all about. He's already watching. This is a command to the rider of the white horse to go forth, to come forth. And this first of the four living creatures spoke with a voice like thunder, saying, "Come," or "Go forth." And John looked, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on it had a bow. A bow is a symbol of power. However, he didn't have an arrow strung on the bow, and it doesn't say anything about a quiver full of arrows. So the thinking here is that it's just the threat of power, the implied power resident in the person that's holding the bow, that gives him his power to go forth conquering and to conquer. As you read commentaries, a few, they're dwindling in number, think that this first writer is Jesus. However, the context would suggest that it's more likely the person that we have called the Antichrist. Revelation doesn't use that term. It uses a beast out of the sea. Or is it out of the land? We'll see that in chapter 13. But in other parts of the Bible and in common conversation, this person is known as the Antichrist. Probably a better term would be instead of Christ, because he's actually going to, in many ways, be a good counterfeit. He's definitely opposed to Jesus and opposed to what he stands for and opposed to the church. And yet, in many ways, he's a counterfeit Jesus. There's a counterfeit Trinity. We'll see that in chapter 13. So anyway, this person riding on this white horse, the vast majority of commentators, particularly conservative commentators, hold that person to be the Antichrist, building his earthly kingdom, going forth to conquering and to conquer. And he's successful for 3.5 years, the first part of the tribulation period. After that, his kingdom starts to unravel internally. So that is the first seal, and we get the sense here that while each of these riders, the impact they have on the earth could be long term, we get a sense of the fact that the seal is actually being revealed and unveiled rather quickly. The second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." We left out the NC part. The New King James is about the only translation that has that. Another horse, fiery red. Fiery adjective there. Fire is a sign of judgment. Red, the sign of blood. It was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth. Is that different from bringing war in the earth? Possibly. It might be easier to take peace and cause people to be at enmity with one another than to actually start a war. He's going to let somebody else start it, probably. He took peace from the earth, that men should kill one another, and there was given to him a great sword. So the second rider is on a red horse, and people begin to murder and kill. And he's given a great sword. The third seal, when he opened the third seal, again the Lamb is opening the seals. I heard the third living creature say, "Come," or "Go forth." And again he's speaking to the rider. This rider's on a black horse, and he had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures. Whose voice is that? Well, let's see what the voice says first. "Quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." So the voice is determining the cost for a quart of wheat. And so we're looking at an inflationary period here. We're looking at a period of scarcity. And if you look back at the second rider, the red horse, when wars begin breaking out and Jesus called it nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, one of the results is that those armies consume all the food they can wherever they go on their campaigns. And so that leaves less for the civilian population, which now is suffering shortages. So the shortages here are primarily in wheat and in barley. Their prices are multiple 10 times, 20 times what they normally are. We'll talk about that in a second. So a quart of wheat for a denarius was roughly a day's wage. 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. Do not harm the oil and the wine. So the oil and the wine, which is really not part of the staple diet of a common person or the poor, the rich are still able to afford the oil and the wine, and so doesn't seem to be any shortage there, at least yet. So, and the voice, who is in control of how expensive things get? In some respects, it's supply and demand, so economic principles might be in play. But who's in the center of the throne, in the midst of the 4 living creatures? That was the description of the Lamb, wasn't it? So this is possibly the one who is opening the seal, unloosing this 3rd seal, is actually specifying the degree to which inflation has taken hold. And then the 3rd seal again. We said there's some inflation in play. Let's look at a denarius of that day. That's bearing, I'm not sure which Caesar that is, but at any rate, it's in that general time period. Now, in a normal economy, this one coin, a denarius, would buy enough wheat to feed a man and his family for several days, maybe even a week. Several quarts a week, quarts of wheat. In the time of the 3rd seal, this coin will buy either 1 quart of wheat, which is a ration for one person for one day, or 3 quarts of barley. Now, barley is a poor man's wheat. Wheat was more expensive than barley. You could get 3 quarts of barley for the same price of 1 quart of wheat. But even 3 quarts of barley is only enough to feed 3 people. So a man with 1 denarius, that's what he's earning if he's fortunate enough to keep a job in these difficult days. He can only feed 3 people. So these are starvation prices. These are families are going to slowly starve to death based on the price of food here. So barley being the poor man's wheat, that's what the average person would buy, and they would, with those 3 quarts of barley, not be able to feed their whole family for a day. So these are some desperate times. Now let's talk a little bit about grain, wine, and new oil. In the Old Testament, grain, wine, and new oil, that's a prophetic code for the provision of God. Think of the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. And so it would appear of the grain, wine, and new oil, the grain is what's been most severely impacted here in the 3rd seal. But let's look at what that actually means in terms of the agricultural calendar. The grain harvest starts with the flax harvest. The arrow there is pointing to the barley harvest, and that's what's mentioned in the 3rd seal. So we'll look at the barley harvest. Starts right around the first part of April, last part of March. How about the wheat? Okay, wheat's a little bit later, takes a little bit longer to grow, and that begins at the end of May, beginning of June, and runs for probably a month or 2. And then how about the wine? The vintage begins towards the end of July into August, and then it will run into September and October. And so between these three items, we've got the calendar covered from March through August. And then finally, if you look at the left side, we see the olive harvest. And I was in the Holy Lands in the time period of, it was the first week of October, and they were harvesting olives. I watched them from the Herodium where Herod was buried. And they still use, they put down blankets underneath the tree and then they beat on the branches just like they did in Jesus' day. And that harvest begins roughly in the beginning to middle of October, and then it runs through December. So let's take away the arrows, and then let's look at the calendar. So when God promises to provide grain, new wine, and oil, how much of the calendar is he actually saying, I've got this, I'm going to cover you for this period? So there's the first part, starting with the flax harvest, running through the vintage, the wine, and then here's the rest of it, covering the olive harvest. So God's promise to provide grain, wine, and new oil really covers most of the agricultural calendar, probably 10 months, 10 and a half months out of the year. That gap there where the green arrow is not covering is when the seed has already been planted, the rains come, and that's when the plants begin to sprout out of the earth. So grain, wine, and new oil is just a symbol of God's care and taking care of the physical needs to feed his people. And so when a prophet promises grain, new wine, and oil, it's a blessing. And likewise, when he promises that God's going to remove it, it's a curse. And it's code in the Old Testament for the provision of God. So here, in this third seal, we have the beginning of the removal of daily food, daily bread. So the curse of Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 is beginning to take hold. And if we kind of sum up the second and third seal, that we come to the fourth seal and see the result. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come," or again, "Go forth." I looked, I saw a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed him. Power was given to them over a fourth of the earth. In today's number, that's today's population on the earth, that would be roughly just under 2 billion people. The current pandemic has claimed 4.5 million lives. 2 billion is about, well, not quite 500 times as large. 500 times as many deaths as there has been in the last 18 months due to the COVID-19 virus. I can't imagine that many people dying. There'd be so many they wouldn't be able to bury them all. Corpses would be decaying on the landscape, and famine, pestilence, disease is going to be rampant. So this fourth seal is kind of the summation of the wars that are going on and the famine that's resulting from the loss of agricultural production and the inflation of the cost of just daily bread, really. And if you look at it, the causes of the death here, the sword, hunger, and death, the sword corresponds to seal number 2. Hunger corresponds to seal number 3, and death corresponds to the seal that we're looking at, seal number 4. And the beasts of the earth, that's another curse in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. The beasts they're held in check when the people are walking in obedience to the Lord. But if the land is devoid of people, if the people have been swept away or taken into captivity to a foreign land, the beasts begin to take over. And in this case, the beasts begin to outnumber the people, and they start killing them because they're hungry too. And so sword, hunger, and death corresponding to seals 2, 3, and 4. So this fourth seal is sort of a kind of a summary statement. The fifth seal, saints under the altar. This could possibly be the looking at the end result. If you remember back in the result of the second seal with the wars and rumors of war and all the deaths that have been taking place. And so the fifth seal, these souls under the altar are basically being held there, and they're crying out, they're asking, Lord, how long is this going to go on? Why don't you intercede for us? And a lot of times, we wonder, God has the power to save these people. Why would he permit them to be killed? And I don't have a good answer for that other than he's God and I'm not. And I think this is a time when if we look at the grace we have today and we go, I'm not sure I could handle that. Well, you're right. You can't, not with the grace we have today. But grace is given when grace is required. And God will, should any of us, I hope we don't, but should any of us face that, I firmly believe that God will provide the grace that's needed at the time. And so they're told, okay, here's a white robe. You guys just hold on. You trust me. And there's actually going to be more joining you. The number is not yet complete. But you just hold your horses, and the time is coming when this will end. So there's martyrs. There's people that are being killed for their faith, and that process is still continuing as we look at the fifth seal. And when we come to the sixth seal, we're going to spend a little time here because the sixth seal has a little bit more to it than the rest of them. And we're going to compare it with what Jesus spoke in Matthew 24. Now this picture, on the left you see the sun black. On the right you see the moon red, blood. On the right you see the stars falling from the sky and striking the earth. You see the signs of an earthquake. And then you see those two swirling things. That's artists trying to capture the idea of the sky being rolled up like a scroll. And so let's look at the language of the sixth seal. Behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair. The moon became like blood. The stars of heaven fell to the earth. The sky receded as a scroll, and every mountain and every island was moved out of its place. Now that's a whole lot of moving going on. That's a huge earthquake. That's probably a series of earthquakes all over. Now what we have here is, if you look towards the bottom of the text, with the quotation there, the last three lines, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? Now, the first thing I want to point out is this is the men of the earth speaking. Every single person on the earth is hiding that has not put his faith in Jesus Christ. They recognize where this is coming from. They recognize that it's God's wrath that's falling on the earth, and yet they refuse to bend their knee. They call for the rocks, for the the mountains and the rocks to fall on us and hide us from the wrath. They think that death is going to be the end, that death is going to shelter them from the wrath of God. And of course their theology is flawed, because we know that's not possible. But at any rate, it's interesting to note that they have recognized who is causing this great calamity here in the sixth seal, and yet they have still refused to bow to him. Now let's compare this sixth seal, it's going to be on the left side of the next screen, with what Jesus said in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24. So if you look, we've got an earthquake, black sun, blood moon, stars falling, sky receding like a scroll. And on the right side, early in chapter 24, Jesus spoke about earthquakes in various places. But here we have almost exact correspondence, line for line, from the sixth seal to what Jesus said immediately after the tribulation of those days. So that correlation would seem to indicate that this sixth seal comes right at the very end, just prior to, as we continue reading here, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. So it would seem that it's reasonable to make the conclusion that the sixth seal occurs immediately before Jesus returns. So I'll let you think about that. That may be a new thought to some of you. That the concept may be a little bit hard to grasp. But at any rate, it would seem a fairly sound conclusion that this sixth seal, given the amazing correspondence between it and what Jesus is saying in Matthew 24, it seems that the sixth seal is right at the very end of the 7-year tribulation period. Continuing on with what Jesus has said, he said, after all these signs in the heavens, the sign of Son of Man will appear in the heaven. And if the stars and the sun and the moon are gone, then that's the only thing in heaven. There's no competition for what's coming next. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. All the tribes will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. Every eye is going to see him. He will send his angels, and he will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So the sixth seal seems to be the very end. At least that's a reasonable conclusion from comparing it with what Jesus had said here in Matthew 24. And then finally, who is able to stand is the negative side of that final judgment, and the positive side is Jesus gathering his elect from the four winds. So just one other point of agreement between these two passages of Scripture. Here's another way to look at it. Just compare the Olivet Discourse on the left this time and the sixth seal on the right. And we have earthquakes on both sides. We have sun darkened both sides. We have the moon, no light. The sixth seal, the moon is blood. We have the stars falling. We have the heavenly powers being shaken in the Olivet Discourse, and the sky being rolled up like a scroll in the sixth seal. And incidentally, that sky being rolled up like a scroll is out of the book of Isaiah. And if we go back to the Olivet Discourse, Jesus prefaces this whole thing with this. We've already talked about this slide. Let me go to the next slide. Jesus said at the outset there, immediately after the tribulation of those days. So again, that seems to indicate, after the tribulation of those days, indicates the end of that, what we expect to be 7 years of tribulation, just prior to Jesus' return. So Jesus seems to tell us by the language he uses in the Matthew chapter 24 that the sixth seal is indeed at the very end of time. So let's look at that. The sign of the Son of Man is coming. He's going to come, and all the tribes are going to mourn. Every knee will bow, and every tongue is going to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So let's take a look at his return. This slide shows him just as a returning with clouds and great glory. Just a kind of a visual image to help us understand that. What's he returning to? As the 7 bowls are poured out, the earth has lost its ability to support life. Every island has been moved, every mountain is not to be found, and so the landscape, the geography has been reordered. He's coming to a planet that has lost the ability to support life. The planet has allowed sin to kill it. The wages of sin is death, and if the planet is steeped in sin and the rejection of God's way, that spiritual law, the wages of sin is death, applies to individuals, it applies to cities, it applies to states, it applies to nations, and here it applies to the world. Jesus is returning to a planet that has allowed sin to kill it. He's going to remove those that are responsible for destroying the planet. There's a verse that we'll look at later in Revelation that says exactly that. And he's going to hold them for judgment. And he's then going to gather his elect from the 4 winds, going to keep them in a safe place, and then he's going to remake the world for the millennial kingdom. It's a partial remake. It's not the perfect heaven and earth of chapters 21 and 22. But when Jesus returns, he's going to put it right, let's say. He's going to fix the world so it's a good place to live again. Again, not the perfect state, not the final eternal state, but an intermediate state that we call the millennial kingdom. Every eye will see him. He's going to be revealed to every eye, and every tongue will confess, every knee will bow. Then they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven. So let's look at this statement in Matthew 24, and it's repeated, not exactly, but a little more clearly in Luke chapter 17. We're going to look at this in the days of Noah. They were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and they did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So as we look at this, some take this to be a depiction of the rapture of the church, and I don't think it's looking at the rapture of the church. If you read this carefully, in the days of Noah, who was taken away? Who was being taken away when the flood came? Now we'll look at Luke. Luke gives us a word that actually makes it very, very clear. This is not the righteous being taken away. Who is them in that statement there? They were eating, they were giving in marriage, they didn't know until the flood came and swept them away. Who is them? Well, it's those who were eating and drinking. It's those who were marrying and giving in marriage. It's those who didn't know until the flood came and swept them away. This is a rapture, actually. We'll see that 2 men are in a field, one's taken, the other's left. 2 women are grinding corn, one's taken, the other one's left. And so these, there are people being removed from the planet, but it's not the righteous. This is not the rapture of the church. The rapture of the church is going to be a secret thing. They're not going to see Jesus. The rest of the world, the unbelievers, all they're going to see is a whole bunch of people are missing, and they're going to try to figure out why. Jesus is not revealed in the rapture of the church, but he is revealed here in his second coming. So this is a rapture, but it's the rapture of the wicked. It's the removal of the wicked from the earth. And when we look at Luke, we'll see that it's even more clear in that. The account in Luke emphasizes that this passage is about the second coming of Christ. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. We're in Luke 17, verses 26 through 30. Again, it's not about the rapture of the church. Listen to the language in Luke. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the flood came and destroyed them all. That's very clear language. That answers our question, who is they, that we asked when we were looking at the Matthew account. They are the wicked. The flood came and destroyed them all. Who's being destroyed? It's the wicked. And so when we get to the part where there are two people in one bed and one of them's taken, the other one's left, there's two women grinding corn, one's taken and the other one's left, the ones that are being taken here, according to Luke, are the ones who are being destroyed. And so again, it's about the removal of the wicked, just like the wicked were destroyed in the flood in Noah's day. And ditto, the same approach you can use to the part that talks about in the days of Lot at Sodom and Gomorrah. The righteous escaped and were still on the earth. Who was destroyed? The wicked were destroyed in those two cities. And this passage in Luke is actually framed by, so it shall be in the days of the Son of Man, when the Son of Man is revealed. And so the fact that they're destroyed tells us it's the wicked that are being removed, and we're talking about the second coming of Jesus, not the rapture of the church. I've already mentioned this, but the rapture of the church will not reveal the Son of Man. Jesus is going to be revealed in his second coming when he comes on the clouds of heaven with great glory and power, and all the angels with him. Every eye's going to see him. This is going to be an unmistakable event. Every single person on the planet is going to be able to look and see Jesus. He's revealed in his second coming. And Luke again uses that language, in the day that the Son of Man is revealed. He is not revealed in the rapture of the church. He is only revealed to the people that, the righteous, the saints, the believers that are raptured. But the rest of the world he is not revealed to. Here, this is the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And so Luke is even more conclusive that this that days of Noah is not talking about the rapture of the church. Read it carefully, come to your own conclusions, but it seems very clear to me that it's talking about the removal of the wicked prior to the millennial kingdom. And when you think about the sheep and the goats judgment in chapter 25 of Matthew, what does Jesus say to those on his right? Come inherit the kingdom prepared for you by my Father. And so he's taking the saints that have survived the great tribulation, and he's inviting them into the millennial kingdom. And to those on his left, the goats, he says, depart from me into everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And so they are not allowed to go into the millennial kingdom. So it makes sense that the righteous would remain on earth to enter the millennial kingdom, and the wicked would be removed from the earth and held for later judgment. So read these two passages carefully. Come to your own conclusions. So that's the final verse of chapter 6, and as we move into chapter 7, I'm going to go back to this slide, after these things, that's a meta tauta again. So John is seeing the events of chapter 7 after these things, but that's what he's seeing, okay? It's not necessarily the events he's going to talk about here are not necessarily sequentially following that sixth seal. In fact, they can't. If that sixth seal is actually the end of days, then obviously these things cannot follow it. There's nothing following it except the millennial kingdom. So what John is seeing, he's seeing after these things, he's looking at something, but what he's looking at is actually taken place already, previously to what he just saw in chapter 6. So he's given us the sequence of what he saw, but not necessarily of the events that he saw. So if we look carefully at this, and we're going to be looking at it rather quickly, he saw 4 angels. They're holding the winds back. Another angel out of the east comes up and says, "Don't harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God." And the first part of chapter 7, we're going to see the 144,000 sealed. And what this angel is saying is, don't do that, and don't harm the earth until that sealing takes place. So what does that tell us? Well, certainly it tells us that the 6th seal harms the earth, doesn't it? The 5th seal harms the believers, the martyrs. The 4th seal, death, that harms the earth. The 3rd seal harms the earth. There's famine. There's a shortage of agricultural products. So that would say that this sealing has to occur sometime in the early, either the 1st or the 2nd seal, in that time frame. And so it doesn't follow the 6th seal. It actually is prior to the 6th seal. So this sealing process has already taken place by the time we get to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th seals, because each of those harms the earth. And so there's a little bit of a disruption of the chronology here, and again, that's probably a hard concept for some of you to grab a hold of if it's the first time you've heard it. But think about it, and as we continue on, we'll realize that we're not looking at a strict chronological order here. The second picture, again, another meta tauta. John sees, after these things I looked, he saw a great multitude, no one could number. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. And crying out with a loud voice. And where are they? They are standing before the throne. Remember back in chapter 6 in the 5th seal, we saw them under the altar, the martyrs. Here there's a large group that no one can number standing before the throne and before the Lamb. So they're in the presence of God. And so there's a group that thinks that this is the final number that was referred to back in the 5th seal in chapter 6. And this would represent the when that last martyr was killed and added to their number that was spoken of back in in the 5th seal. And so this possibly could be looking at the very end of the tribulation period. So interestingly, chapter 7, with these two pictures of the sealing of the 144,000, that apparently needs to happen somewhere early in the time frame of the 1st and 2nd seal judgments. And this picture of the saints standing before the throne of God and before the Lamb towards the end of the tribulation period. So possibly bracketing this 7-year period, with the sealing of the 144,000 occurring early in the 7 years, and this picture of the martyred saints occurring later in the picture. And it could be this is the answer. How long, O Lord? Remember we asked that the martyred saints were asking God, how long will it be, Lord, until you avenge our blood? And this may answer that question. Back in, if you want to go back and look at it, it's verses 11 and 12 in chapter 6. So 2 pictures in chapter 7. 144,000 being sealed, which may have happened early in the 7 years, and the completion of the martyrdom of the saints in the tribulation, and this picture occurring much later, towards the end of the tribulation period. So, summary of chapter 6. The first 6 seal judgments: the white horse, the red horse, the black horse, the pale horse, the souls beneath the altar, the 5th seal, and then the 6th seal, the final days, the black sun, blood moon, stars falling, and so forth. Then the summary of chapter 7, 2 major events: the instructions from the angel that has come up from the east: do not harm the earth until the servants of God are sealed. It seems to take us back in time to earlier in the tribulation period. And then we have the souls before the throne, which, as I said, possibly could be in the final days. So that's chapter 6 and chapter 7. And with that, we'll bring this particular flight to a close. We're going to be landing and pulling up to the gate here, so feel free to write your questions down and send them to me via email or call me, message me, however you want to communicate, and we'll be discussing all these things this coming Wednesday evening. So God bless each one of you. Thanks for listening.